So this is lesson 1 in our second unit on multiplication and division. In this lesson, we're going to be comparing multiplication and division facts, and we're going to be building on our understanding of commutativity, which is the idea of in multiplication, it doesn't matter which order the numbers are in, it's always going to give you the same answer. And we're going to be using that to spot patterns and recall that division is not commutative, and we'll make comparisons using the greater than, less than, and equals to symbols. So now it's time to open our textbooks, and we can see in our Discover section we've got our first image, and this shows Richard and Lexi both stood at their tables, and they have a selection of fruit. They've got some apples and they've got some pears on their table. Now question 1 asks, who has more apples? Is it Richard or Lexi? And just before we start thinking about this, I want us to ask ourselves some questions. Question 1. Do you think you need to work out the answers for both those? So how many apples Richard has and how many apples Lexi has in order to compare these amounts? When we're doing that, we're going to be thinking about which number is the same in both calculations. Does this actually help us compare, or does it confuse and muddy the waters slightly? So now what I'd like you to do is just pause the video, and I just want you to have a go at this first question. So looking at the image from your textbook, who has more apples? Is it Richard or is it Lexi? So if you remember, my first question I asked was, who has more apples? Is it Richard or Lexi? And the first thing we were starting to look at is, do we need to actually solve the calculations for both people to work out what the answer is, to be able to compare them? And of course the answer for this is going to be yes. Whatever strategy we use, we need to find out how many apples Richard has and how many apples Lexi has. So let's take a look at this first question. So who has more apples, Richard or Lexi? And the very first thing I asked you to sort of help with this was, do you need to work out the answer to be able to actually compare the two amounts? And of course for this case, it's definitely going to be a yes. So I'm going to use an array to help me actually work out this answer. So looking at Richard, I've got 1, 2, 3 apples in one set. And I've got 2, 3, 4. So in this case, Richard has got 4 sets of 3, or 4 lots of 3. And I've drawn that in my array, as you can see, just below. If we look at our next calculation, which is Lexi, we can do exactly the same. So Lexi has, in this case, 3 apples in each set. And Lexi's got 2, 3, 4, and 5. So whereas Richard's got 4 lots of 3, Lexi has 5 lots of 3. And now we can simply add those up together. We can skip count. We can use whichever strategies we can have. So in this case, I've got Richard. I've got 3, 6, 9, 12. And Lexi has 3, 6, 9, 12, 15 apples. So in this case, we can see by using our array, using one of our known strategies to actually find out how many apples in total Richard has, how many apples in total Lexi has, we've been able to compare these two amounts. Now looking at our next question, we could have actually possibly sped it up a little bit. Which number is the same in both calculations? And does this help us compare? Well, we know that the apples are being sold in lots of 3. So if Richard has 4 lots of 3, 4 packs of apples, and Lexi has 5 lots of 3, 5 lots of packs of apples, then we know that Lexi must actually have more because she's got 5 packs compared to Richard's 4 packs. So we can use little shortcuts like that. But we need to know how many they've actually got to guarantee that we are going to be correct. And this now leads us on to our next thing, which is where we're going to look at the idea of a greater than, less than, or equals to symbol. So now we're going to be comparing our 12 apples or 15 apples, the amount that Richard has compared to the amount that Lexi has. And in order to do this, we're going to be using those symbols in the middle. Now you'll have seen these symbols before, sort of arrows pointing different ways and parallel lines. But we're going to look a little bit more about what these actually mean and a method that hopefully is going to help you remember in the long term. Because these are things that are going to be used quite a lot mathematically, probably for as long as you're doing maths. So on our top one, you can see that I've added some dots into it. I've added 4 dots in total. And I've tried to space these out. This is a way that I help myself to remember what these symbols mean. So if we look, my first number on the left is 1 dot. And then on the right, I have 3 dots. So this is telling me that this symbol means 1 is less than 3. So 1 being on the left side, the first thing that I see, 3 being on the right side, the next thing. So 1 is less than 3. This then takes us to our second one, the triangle in the middle. And we can see here that my first number is 3 and my second number is 1. So 3 is greater than 1. And my final one is those equal symbol, the 2 parallel lines. And of course, these sides times both sides are the same size. So there's 2 and 2. So if you think about when we're using these symbols, when you're using the less than symbol, well, you can fit less on the left-hand side than on the right-hand side. So the left-hand side number is less than the right-hand side number. The greater than, the left-hand side is bigger than the right-hand side. So you can fit more or greater than on the left than on the right. And on an equal symbol, both are exactly the same size. So we know that left must be the same as right. So in this case, we've got our 12 apples and our 15 apples. So looking at those, we can identify which one of those symbols will be the right one. So pause the video, and I want you to work it out and just make sure that you're happy with what you've done so far in your book. And of course, our answer is the very top one. 12 apples is indeed less than 15 apples. So we can put those two together. So well done on our first question. So our second set of questions is Richard's bags each have the same amount of pears in them. And each of Lexi's bags have the same number of pears in them. So whose bag contains the least number of pears? And if we look at the speech bubbles, we know that in total, Richard has 20 pears. That means Lexi, because she's saying she has the same amount of pears as Richard, must have 20 pears as well. So Richard, 20 pears in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bags. And Lexi, 20 pears in 1, 2 bags. So your question now is, whose bags contain the least amount of pears? So think carefully about this. Firstly, think, how many pears are there in Richard's bags? And how many pears does Lexi have? And then the next thing is, who has the greatest number of bags of pears? And does this help solve the problem? So now give this one a go in your books. So for our second question, we were asking whose bags contain the least numbers of pears. And our first little tip that we were giving ourselves was to find out how many pears do they both have altogether. And of course, when we looked at the speech bubbles, we could see straight away that Richard was telling us he has 20 pears, and Lexi saying she has the same number. So this means, if we're thinking about this logically, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bags are going to contain 20 pears, and 1, 2 bags are going to contain 20 pears as well. And this is where my bar model is going to come in slightly as a useful friend. So the first thing we decided was Richard had 20 pears altogether. And he has 5 bags. So what I'm going to just do is going to nicely chop 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Then we can have a look at Lexi, who again has 20 pears. And in her case, she has 2 bags. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to divide my 20 pears for Richard into 5 bags. So I've used 5 pears so far, and 1 in each bag. I've used 10 pears so far, 2 in each bag. $15 pears and 3 in each bag. And now 20, and there's 4 in each bag. And now I'm going to do exactly the same with Lexi. 2 pears so far, 4 pears, 6 pears, 8 pears, 10 pears, So 20 pairs in total, and there's 10 in each bag. So now we've calculated that Richard has 4 pairs in each bag, and Lexi has 10 pairs in each bag. So whose bag contains the least number of pairs? Well, knowing that least means the smallest or the lowest, then that must be Richard. And we can use our previous idea of, can I tell by how many bags they've got? Well, if it's the same number, if you divide it by a larger number, or separate them or share them into more groups, you're always going to have a smaller number. 10 shared by one person will give them 10. 10 shared by 10 people will give them 1 each. So think about that number and how many groups you're going to share them into. So now we've gone through that first question, you're ready to continue through that textbook on your own. Now think about the 2 strategies we've looked at. When we've been multiplying, we've been using those arrays to show that calculation, to show how many groups of how many, and being able to really visualize which one's greater than, which one's less than, which one's equal to. When you're looking at your division, we were looking at the idea of sharing into that amount of groups. So when we had our 20 put into 5 bags, 20 divided by 5. When it was 20 put into 2 bags, 20 divided by 2. So something you could physically do yourself. You could draw that bar model and actually place those shapes in. You could draw them out if need be, just to make sure you're visualizing those ideas really, really clearly. And then with our greater than, less than, and equals to symbols, be thinking, if you were actually reading them out to yourselves and using the idea of the larger part of that gets the bigger number, the smaller part gets the smaller number, and if they're both the same, they're going to get equals to. Can you work out that this number is greater than that number and what that shape would be? This number is less than this number and what that shape would be. And then finally, our equals to this number is the same as this number. So good luck with this textbook. Feel free to come back to the video at any point that you need.